Welcome, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Am I echoing? Thank you so much for coming to this session. This is a collaboration of AERA and SRCD, and I want to just talk for a moment about the purpose of the collaboration. The purpose is to look at the synergy between our fields. Both fields
Those were the angels singing.
So I'll just talk loud and you tell me if you can hear me. Both fields focus on children's development, but they do so through a slightly different set of lenses. Can't hear. Oh, I do hope this doesn't.
There's a hand mic over there, right?
Here, I have a hand.
Did you turn yours off?
I did turn it off.
Oh, why don't you turn it on and let him adjust for the feed.
Okay. So the two fields both focus on children's development, but they do so through a different set of lenses. One focusing especially on developmental processes, and the other on educational context, on educational outcomes. But both have a deep commitment to strengthening the development and outcomes for children. So the question before us in the collaboration of AERA and the Society for Research in Child Development is, what different do we think about and learn if we put both sets of lenses together? Do we change the questions we ask? What can we learn from each other by entering the study and understanding of how to strengthen children's development through these different portals? And we have identified a group of fellows who are interested in this kind of synergy. And can I just ask if the fellows who are present could stand for a moment so we can recognize you and say thank you? We're just so delighted that you are interested in stretching your thinking to include both entry points and looking for the synergies. And we hope that this kind of approach is shared and spreads to others. So the focus of today's roundtable is on fade out of early childhood programs. And we have a wonderful panel. I'm going to turn in a moment to introduce the issue of fade out and provide some questions to frame our discussion. But I wanted first to introduce the panelists and the format we're going to be following. They reflect leadership both from SRCD and AERA, and my introduction is in the order of their presentations, not of their importance. These are all unbelievably wonderful contributors to the study and understanding of how to strengthen children's development. So first is Deborah Vandell, Professor of Education at the School of Education at University of California, Irvine, whose work has focused on studies spanning early childhood and school-age care, and our presentation just this morning was on the school-age portion, but we're so fortunate that she looks across these. And Greg Duncan is a distinguished professor from the same School of Education and University of California at Irvine, who's an economist and a former president of SRCD, whose interdisciplinary work looks at evaluation studies for families and children, economic as well as developmental aspects, and also longitudinal research. Elizabeth Grau is a professor of curriculum and instruction at the Wisconsin Center for Education Research at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She's a professor of early childhood education in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction and a former kindergarten teacher. She studies early childhood policy and practice. And so I always feel so grateful to have the perspective of someone who's been in that spot. When I observe quality in early childhood classrooms, I always feel queasy evaluating these magicians who manage to juggle so much at once. So I'm so grateful we have that perspective as well as of research. And lastly, and absolutely not leastly, is Vivian Gadsden, the president of AERA, who's also the William T. Carter Professor of Child Development and Professor of Education, Professor of Africana Studies, Faculty, Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies, and Director of the Center on Fathers and Families. And I want to point out a recent chairmanship that's very important to today's discussion, which was a National Academy of Sciences panel on parenting of children between birth and 8, and people should really get the committee report. It's amazing. It's called Parenting Matters. So now turning to the substance, the title of our session is The Long-Term Outcomes of Early Child Care and Education and What to Make of Middle Years Fade Out. We have very fortuitous timing for this panel because a report has just been released focusing on the evidence not of all early childhood programs, but especially of those at scale. So we now have 42 states with pre-K programs or preschool programs. Not all of them have evaluations, and there's a wonderful map in this report showing where there are evaluations, where they're short-term, long-term, or both, or not at all. But we're now beginning to really have evaluations of early childhood programs at scale, and this is a group that convened with foundation funding. Many times consensus reports are convened by organizations like the National Academies. This one is independent, but it said the issues here are A, important, and B, difficult, complex, and it's very important to have a group reach consensus about them and articulate a conclusion together. And I'm going to read just two statements from the report that I think will be informative. Here are two consensus statements. The first is that across this set of studies at scale, there is convincing evidence showing that children attending a diverse array of state and school district pre-K programs are more ready for school at the end of the pre-K year than children who do not attend pre-K. However, when you move out to elementary school years, this is the conclusion of the group. Convincing evidence on the longer-term impacts of scaled-up pre-K programs on academic outcomes and school progress is sparse, precluding broad conclusions. So this is very important. It says we've got lots of studies of immediate effects, few of long-term effects. And then the bottom line of this group about that body of evidence is the evidence that does exist often shows that pre-K programs induced improvements in learning and are detectable during elementary school, but studies reveal null or negative longer-term impacts for some programs. So this is basically, in other sections of the report, they conclude that there are promising effects, but mixed. And that's the challenge before us. And I'm just going to read one other statement from the report because I thought it was so beautiful and humble and should guide the way we approach the discussion today. Our report is notable for its frank assessment of evidence, and our groups struggle to develop a consensus based on studies that often produced conflicting results. We believe that conflicting evidence is what drives science forward and fuels rather than retards innovation. Conflicting evidence on the enduring effects of pre-K is forcing us to think harder and more clearly about what is reasonable to expect of pre-K programs, to deploy the best scientific tools we have at our disposal, to resolve the conflicting findings, and to adapt our theories to promote understanding of practices and strategies that increase the odds of producing both short-term and long-term effects. So it's really in the spirit of that humility and desire to keep building the evidence and inform our future efforts that this panel is drawn together. I want to say that in planning for the panel, we agreed on a set of questions that the panelists were going to choose from and discuss. These are questions that we would like to pose to you too. We're going to have opening statements of 5 to 7 minutes, a chance for panelists to respond to each other's opening statements, and then we're going to turn it over. And this is not the traditional question and answer period. We welcome questions, but we would also welcome you to jump in and add from where you sit in practice, in research, in the space between them about this set of issues. So very quickly, what were the issues that we wanted to focus on, or the questions? The first is fade out the right term? Are we really talking about children who lose an initial boost, or about other groups that catch up? Is this convergence instead of fade out? The second question is, should we focus on the immediate experiences, sustained experiences, or both? So are the concurrent experiences of young children important, even if there are no sustained effects? Should we be focusing on both? A third is, why was a consensus process needed here? What's so difficult here? A third was, what are the features of early childhood programs that really do sustain the boost? And then, going beyond educational contexts, should we be thinking only about educational contexts in this discussion? Or is family important? Are there other settings that are important? And what about the transition to kindergarten? Thinking about that amazing magician in the classroom, balancing so many needs, what are kindergarten teachers and early education teachers facing when they welcome a group of new students, some of whom have had the boost and some have not? So please feel welcome to join us in discussing any and all of these questions later on. I'm going to turn it over now. We're going to speak in the order that I indicated. Please, Deborah, welcome and your interest in your introductory comments.
Okay, thank you. I'm delighted to be here today. It is particularly good that we're having this conversation following the consensus report that Marty discussed. That report was authored by 10 people. Deborah Phillips was the first author of the report. There are a number of themes that I think highlight agreement across the field. And as we move forward, I think it's important to look both at the agreement and at places where research can guide the next sets of questions. And so in terms of agreement, the agreement on short-term effects are robust across studies with evidence that low-income children and English learners are those that may be particularly benefiting from high-quality programs and that those programs are being offered at scale. This issue of mixed effects is really an interesting one and important. It echoes the mixed effects that we saw even in those early classic studies. So Abecedarian, Perry Preschool, the Chicago Child Parent Centers all had mixed effects in the middle term. The places where they sometimes continued to have effects may point some directions for us to be looking for mixed, when we're looking at those effects on things like reducing grade retention, reducing chronic absences, reduced special education placements, maybe some of the mechanisms, even when we start to see decreases in, or the lack of effects on test scores. I think that one of the big places for research to be going forward is to understand what's happening in elementary school and in middle school that results in where we sometimes see effects and we sometimes don't. In the recent studies, we don't really have the long-term effects. So it's too soon to be talking about long-term effects. So it's actually too soon to be talking about fade out. It's too soon to be talking about catch up or convergence, really. We've always had some mixing going on with those mixed effects, in my judgment. I think that what we need to be then looking at is what can we be doing in the short term and to make programs high quality. What can we be doing to make programs during the early childhood period build on one another as opposed to being repetitious where we know we don't get the same kind of effects? What can we be doing to increase the alignment between early childhood and elementary school and middle school to ensure that the effects, the benefits that we're getting can be sustained because we're not having kids repeat what they already know. And then I guess the last point that I would like to make is to put the pre-K experience, the early childhood experience in context. And I worry some about the loss in funding to early childhood programs while we understand what it takes to make programs effective. The most current data that I'm aware of show that some 90% of high-income children in the top quintile, are receiving pre-K programs or receiving early education programs as 4-year-olds, while about 60% of low-income children are. So even now we have this inequity in access to preschool programs that is worrisome for me. I think it should be worrisome for all of us. And I'm also worried about the cost of programs where in many states early care programs are rivaling the cost of higher education and families can't really afford programs. And so the role of public investment in programs is one that I think that we need to be including in this discussion, and public investment in high quality programs, which we know are associated with benefits in the short term. And I believe what we're going to have to do is find out what we need to be doing to sustain them in the midterm and in the long term.
All right. It's great to be here. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about the report. I was a member of the group that put it together. Christina Weiland is another member. I see she's in the audience. I don't know if there are others, but I thought, there you are. I thought I might spend a little bit of time just talking about the process by which the report came out. It was really the brainchild of Deborah Phillips and Ron Haskins. Ron Haskins is the Brookings Institution. They raised money from the Heising-Simons Foundation and from the Packard Foundation. At the same time, as it turns out, Ken Dodge had this same idea and was putting together an effort to summarize what we know from pre-K. And they discovered each other and merged together to some extent their efforts. But the basic Brookings group, which, by the way, you can see on the Brookings website. There was a session about a week ago where Deborah presented the report, and there were a couple of panels talking about the report. There was a director of early education from Tennessee who was there to talk about Tennessee. So it's a very nice discussion of the issues that we're going to be talking about today. And you can download the report from the Brookings website also. So we met starting in October, I think, of last year. Mark Lipsey was one of the members, and the first thing Mark Lipsey thinks about is, let's do a meta-analysis. So he set about to try to identify all of the evaluation studies that have been done on pre-K, both end-of-year evaluations as well as longer run evaluations. And it turns out there are several dozen of them. They're listed in the back of the report. He's now doing a formal meta-analysis, but just an effort to put together the data so we could look and try to make sense out of how uniform it was. And as Deborah says, it was fairly uniform on impacts at the end of the pre-K year. Almost all studies that evaluate pre-K find quite significant gains, especially along academic dimensions, especially for dual language learners, especially for disadvantaged kids. So that was pretty rosy, but then the picture on what happened afterwards was decidedly mixed. I think the most famous mixed result came out of Tennessee, and was studied by Mark Lipsey, which had actually a random assignment component. Usually these pre-K studies are based on regression discontinuity designs where you've got a birthday cutoff and people who just make it versus miss it are compared. But he had, in Tennessee, the cooperation of the state of Tennessee to actually do a random assignment experiment. There are always complications, but they were generating impacts quite substantial at the end of pre-K, but by the end of third grade, they were actually negative and significant, on the order of maybe 1/10 of a standard deviation negative. The negative results are quite rare. Null results are more common, but there are also some positive results. So it was just impossible to come to any conclusion. The positive results tend to be from weaker kinds of studies where people take data, say, in third grade and know which children were in pre-K and which children weren't, and try to match them up on the basis of free reduced lunch and demographic characteristics. So it's not a very strong basis. There's no sort of pre-test that you can equate, or there's certainly no random assignment either. So it was hard to make a conclusion about long-term effects, or intermediate-term effects, I should say. It's impossible to make it on truly long-term effects, the kind of adult outcomes that we have from Perry and Abecedarian and studies like that. But I've also been taking a broader look with another group of people in a meta-analytic effort to try to make sense out of all the early childhood education programs that have been evaluated going back to 1960. And if you look at the fade-out patterns there, what you tend to find is steep fade-out, a geometric decline, actually, an impact on cognitive outcomes. You lose about half of the end of treatment impact within a year. You lose another half of that within a couple more years. So we know that there are these exceptions with Perry and Abecedarian and some early Head Start analyses, but by far the more common pattern, especially for cognitive kind of outcomes, IQ, math scores, reading scores, things like that, is one of fade out. And I've spent some time with a colleague at Irvine, Drew Bailey, and Candace Odgers, who's a psychopathologist at Duke, trying to think about what would be behind fade out. And I guess I came to the conclusion, I was a big fan of pre-K coming in, early education in general, but I came to decide why in the world would we expect there to be long-term impacts from early education, right? This is a time when kids are gaining very, very rapidly a standard deviation a year, even if they're not in pre-K, in terms of math scores, in terms of reading scores. Their self-regulation capability is developing very rapidly. So, and that continues across kindergarten, across first grade, right? So it's a very dynamic kind of setting. And if you're moving their academic skills ahead during the pre-K year and are not taking special efforts to nurture those skills, right, once they bring them into kindergarten classrooms, you often have a situation where you have a kindergarten classroom where maybe 5 of the kids in the kindergarten classroom have had pre-K or Head Start. They've had this boost. But the teachers are focused first and foremost on making sure that the kids who don't have the basic skills get the basic skills, right? Is probably what their first priority should be. But it's a very difficult thing for a teacher to simultaneously teach the basic skills to the kids who don't have them and promote the skills that the kids who've been through pre-K or been through Head Start already have. I think middle class, upper middle class schools have teachers who can do that, but it's a real trick. And I don't think a lot of teachers in schools serving disadvantaged kids are able to do that very effectively. So what you see is this kind of catch-up where there's a transitory boost across the pre-K or Head Start year, and then the control group is just chugging ahead, standard deviation a year in their learning, and then you get this kind of convergence, right? So how do we approach that problem? Well, one way is to try to focus on improving the nature of instruction in kindergarten and first grade to take advantage of the gains that kids already have. Another is just to think of what would happen if pre-K plus Head Start plus other kind of quality early education settings were so pervasive that almost all the kids coming into the kindergarten classroom had these basic skills, right? It would be kind of like the kind of kindergarten classrooms for upper middle class schools, right? Where the kindergarten teachers can assume a much higher level of kind of basic skills and can build on those. You can have a curriculum that builds on those. So operating at a much bigger scale than we've certainly increased the scale for pre-K, and long ago we increased it for Head Start. But once you get to the point, maybe New York City with its universal pre-K, and now universal pre-K for 3-year-olds, right? That initiative was just announced. Once you get to a point where there's sufficient scale that most of the kids in kindergarten are going to have these skills, you can just think differently about what the curriculum should look like, what the instruction should look like. So that gives me hope, and it makes it's going to make pre-K another year of school. It's going to be different from K-12 schooling. Kids learn through play. They shouldn't be sitting in their desks and doing worksheets when they're 4 years old, but they can learn a lot. We know a lot about how to design curricula that are play-based, and kids have fun, and they also learn these skills as well. So the kind of vision that I have of a system that produces gains that are actually sustained would be one in which you have this kind of scale coupled with very serious linkage between what goes on in pre-K and Head Start, what goes on in the kindergarten classroom, and what goes on in the first grade classroom. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I want to start by thanking AERA and SRCD for this opportunity to have groups come together that might not come together normally. It's exciting to see an initiative that's working to try to build capacity, particularly among young scholars, for research across broad bounds, but also to build research communities. I think those are where you start having the best synergies and the most movement ahead, where you can really learn some things. I do want to note, as Marty said, I come to this discussion from a slightly different perspective, from practice. You know that song in Sesame Street, one of these things is not like the other? That's me. And it's the case because I come through a practitioner perspective. My bachelor's degree was a teacher ed program in early childhood education. I've worked as a early childhood special ed teacher and a kindergarten teacher. And when I was in practice, I can remember looking at headlines that came in the newspaper saying things like, Head Start does not work. And I thought, how can that be? That didn't make any sense to me. So I actually went to graduate school to try to understand what the issues were in the research methodology, so I could look under the hood in that research machine. And so what I'm going to be talking about today is looking both from kind of a practitioner perspective and also from a research methodologist perspective. And I want to make two related points. The first is that I absolutely agree that we have to get a better sense of what the pre-K3 educational context is like. We won't be able to understand what this, whatever it is, whether it's called FADE or whatever happens as kids converge with their age mates. We all know that pre-K isn't an inoculation that can overcome all of the challenges that kids have. And we also know, for example, one of the most interesting things that have come out is that many kindergarten children receive the same math instruction that covers skills they already have when they come into kindergarten. And Claessens and Engel and their colleagues have done a good job of unpacking that to help you understand why would teachers be teaching what's already known. But I want to add something from policy enactment research that tells a little bit about why. In the work that I've done with pre-K and the movement into kindergarten, over and over again, kindergarten teachers did not take a look at the assessments that came with children from pre-K. Pre-K teachers spend a lot of time gathering both standardized measures and kind of unstandardized portfolio documentation. And I've heard answers like, I want that child to come to me with a clean slate. Or they say they don't have time to look at it, given all the work they have to do. And I've actually had people say, I don't trust what the pre-K teachers have to say. Now, to me, that seems wasteful and short-sighted. Of course, every child should come with a clean slate. Every morning, a child should come with a clean slate. But that doesn't mean ignoring important information about what somebody's experience was in a very important year prior to that. So why is that important? I'm worried that we're ignoring a lot of very interesting research that tells us about the who and why and how things happen in pre-K and K3 that will help us understand the educational, the social, the political forces that shape what teachers and children do, and the effects on curriculum implementation and teacher-child interactions, all pieces that are always very important in these broader evaluations. We're struggling to understand effective practices. It's not easy. But I would say it's not just a measurement problem. It's not just that we don't have the right measures. Measurement is important, but it's not solely that. And we also can't understand it just by trying to get very rigorous measures of fidelity of implementation. Because I think anybody that's ever been in a classroom knows that curriculum as a thing isn't what exists on the paper or on the implementation checklist. It's all the noisy life that occurs around it. So I would really hope that we would work to get rigorously designed and conducted studies on policy enactment and evaluation of programs. That we would look at things like the decision-making that's made from the policy level, where people are making decisions about what pre-K or K-3 will get, and then how resources are allocated and utilized. We need to look at how policy requirements work together and sometimes absolutely clash. I've been in so many classrooms in public pre-K programs that are in childcare centers where they, because of licensing requirements, they can't go outside until an additional person is brought in to cover, and class stops until the additional staff comes. That's downtime that could be avoided if we did a better job of making sure that every minute's used. There's a good work out there that is in the policy enactment realm. For example, Lisa Goldstein's work on kindergarten teachers' decision-making, Chris Brown's work on pre-K teachers' work around accountability policies to try to keep their practice in ways they want. Bethany Walensky's work on public pre-K teachers in different kinds of settings. We need new methodological innovations to do interpretive synthesis, to build across studies, and also engage with the qualitative work that has been so strongly contributing here. The trick is to recognize that no one study will tell you everything. You have to learn how to build composites of studies that allow you to see the array of things that are going on. We need strong mixed methods studies that have the complementary findings baked right into the design, so everything is working together. We need the commitment of policy guiding groups to follow the example here and use diverse tools and views in the classroom. I just want to say that we need to use every tool in the toolbox and involve a broad array of scholars to solve a really, really challenging empirical problem. And this right here is a great start. Thanks.
Well, so first of all, I'd like to just thank this panel and thank SRCD for collaborating with AERA around this meeting. This is something that we have dreamed of for a long time. I'm active in SRCD, and obviously I'm active in AERA. And this was an issue of convergence as well, kind of shared beliefs and shared hopes around this issue. And what Beth didn't say is that this is a part of an AERA initiative on this topic, and Beth and Sharon and Felice and I are editing a volume that should come out the end of this year that will focus on this issue. But I really am just so delighted that the fellows were selected, and you all did terrific work in your applications. The consensus report provides a really nice statement to cross early learning and early development. And I appreciate the opportunity to think through how we can best make use of our knowledge in order to craft a more targeted effort across both. Now, there are some ideas and ways of thinking that are unique to each area of study, but there's a shared commitment in building the best foundation for children and opportunities for parents, teachers, and others to support that foundation. So I just have a few things that came to mind. And these came to mind in part because we were doing this session, but they were a part of some considerations that my colleague John Fantuzzo and Paul McDermott and I had over time because of a study that we did in Philadelphia. And my own study, even before that, where I worked with kids and families in pre-K, and then I looked at them again over time, but when they got to grade 5. So One thing that was really striking for me in the report was its statement that despite our certainty that many of the early education programs produce positive outcomes for children, but we need to uncover what it was precisely about these programs that produced the positive outcomes. That's a very telling and critical statement. So there are questions that we could ask, such as for which children were the outcomes most significant? With what set of home and sociocultural experiences? With what set of classroom experiences? With what teaching and other forms of engagement in the schools? And with what component program features? And then there is, for me, the question of instructional formats and classroom pedagogy, whether and how those matter, including the interactions with between teachers and kids, the teachers' expectations, as well as the follow-up. So when we looked at the kids who came from an early childhood program in Philadelphia that primarily served low-income African American and Puerto Rican children, and we looked at what happened to them in kindergarten even, we found such a huge sense of alienation once the kids went to kindergarten, because that attention, it wasn't simply, they were used to attention, they were used to people moving back and forth and making an effort to understand their language, and it just wasn't happening when they got to kindergarten. So that's not going to show up on an assessment measure, right? But that's what those little children are figuring out, and those little children are figuring out every day how to navigate the new spaces in which they find themselves. There's a question about, is there something about formal schooling itself, different from but including instruction, that facilitates learning, or does not? What does the space look like in which children travel? I think it was Deborah Stipek, who talked about children being ready for school, but schools being ready for children. And I think that's at the heart of this issue. What are the capacities of different school settings to support young children and the teachers of young children? How prepared are faculty and administrators to welcome young children and teachers? And this is a really kind of basic issue in education. What is the preparation of early childhood teachers? In my own faculty, as it turns out, the person who taught the early childhood courses was also a developmental psychologist. And she did such a terrific job of going back and forth, right? But you can actually get a degree in some places and not really know very much about early childhood development. And you can get a degree without knowing that much about families or culture or a number of other issues. And what do we need to know about teaching itself? How are concepts from developmental science, such as serve and return, really understood and enacted in classrooms or not? I want to say one thing about what I just noticed. So we've been thinking about at Penn, what happens from pre-K to grade 5, grade 6? And that's in part, and I see Darryl here, and you know this happened, because when we went to see the early childhood teachers, and in Philadelphia, Head Start is in the public school system, right? So the teachers are degreed. The teachers who were teaching 3rd grade did not even know the pre-K teachers. In fact, in some schools, they actually forgot that Head Start was in the same building. So with that kind of isolation, should we be surprised that there is little continuity? But the opportunities are enormous for creating that opportunity between and across these different areas. And it's a larger issue of professional development, but it's something that's worthwhile. And then, how well integrated are integrated curricula? What are the opportunities for researchers from these slightly different domains? We all know each other, so we know we're not that different, to talk. I think one of the things that we've learned is how long it actually takes to build the relationships between and among researchers in these different areas. But it is doable, because there are strengths that Beth would have, Deborah may not have, and strengths that Well, Greg has all the strengths. But strengths that Marty has, you know, when we were doing the National Academies report, I picked up the phone and I called Marty because there were some things that Marty knew about what was going on at the state level that I wanted to be able to bring back. And so it's creating a network that allows that kind of cross-fertilization of ideas and to be able to do it in a way that's unintimidating. And then, what sources do early childhood teachers need to advance their work, including opportunities to work on and examine their own emotional dispositions to the work? Edna McConnell-Clark, I think this is right, is about to venture on this particular topic. What counts as teachers' emotional well-being and being able to do their work? And I want to just reinforce that because foundations like the Foundation for Child Development, on whose board I serve, is very interested in what happens around teaching the workforce and instruction, which of course was another National Academies of Sciences report. So I see these as some pathways that, some of which are traditional pathways, but others are areas of work that may not initially seem to be relevant, but they actually are, and they're opportunities for us to think about what happens to kids, both in the short term, but also think through to what is actually happening to them later. So thanks a lot.
I'm just going to begin by thanking the panelists for these wonderful comments and to say that several things jumped out at me. One is how important it is to bring together the education and the developmental perspective. And I'm just going to zero in on your comment about that, Vivian, of what would happen if we could study children's engagement in pre-K and in K and look at engagement cliffs? And is there a parallel for families? Is there an engagement cliff for families? So how important to take these two lenses. And the second is the new issues for research that have jumped out just listening to the panelists. So to me, one example is, Greg, your issue of compositional differences. If you have a pre-K program that's saturated, what happens in kindergarten? Does that differ from if you're in a context where you don't have a high saturation? So compositional studies seem very important. So before we turn it over to an open discussion, let me just ask panelists, were there other things that jumped out at you that struck you from listening to the different perspectives on the panel that you want to react to?
I wanted to connect with Beth about the mixed method research. I'm a big fan of mixed method research and have learned a lot from projects that incorporate both quantitative and qualitative methods. I think they tend to get balkanized in education, and qualitative research is almost non-existent, right, in developmental psychology, I think. I encourage my dissertation students, if they're doing several essays, to have, and they're primarily oriented toward a quantitative approach, to have one of their essays be a qualitative study.
Yay.
A recent example, Liz Miller, who just went off into a postdoc at NYU, was looking at dual language learners in Head Start. And the Head Start Impact Study has data that you can try to see under what kind of classroom circumstances are they doing well versus not. And I just urged her to go out and observe, right? In Orange County, there are a lot of dual language learning classrooms. And every time she sees me, she thanks me for having done that.
And I'll thank you too.
Okay, so this is an encouragement, right? And I'm sure you have more experience with this than I do, and might have some wisdom about mixing methods.
Well, this does my heart good. I think the challenge is that mixed method work is hard. It's using strategies that have different assumptions, and often when you propose something, the quant people think the sample's too small. The qual people think the sample's too big. And so you have to find ways to interweave, and often I think, to avoid balkanization, you have to have team members who are really willing to collaborate. I think another challenge is when I was an associate editor for AERA, we would get these reviews of research that said, this is all the research on winky dinks. And I'd say, wait a minute, you're missing all the case studies, all the ethnographies, all the interview studies. And what I could get out of them is the title would now say, a review of the quantitative research on. Yeah, so I think it's going to take a lot of hard work with people willing to collaborate, to give and receive and build teams in a mindful way so that you can have different ways of looking at a problem.
Can I just say something? Yeah, I actually have that down here.
Oh, good.
Because I do believe it's mixing, it's not simply the binary of qualitative and quantitative. I think it's trying to bring together, and I believe very strongly in having teams of people. And as I said before, it takes a lot of effort. Mm-hmm. But if you can end up on the same page, at least about what your mission is, then I think there are multiple ways to approach this. So there are the case studies, there are the observations. But there are other forms that are really kind of useful, and I'm in a place where people are doing some of this, where they're doing narratives and discourse analysis. And when we've been able to work as a team, bring those different ways of thinking, what counts as data and what data count, then we actually end up with a much richer kind of perspective on what the issues are, because the goal is not to, we're not celebrating, the methodological approach. We're trying to uncover, what the issues are and how to address them. Mm-hmm. So I really like the idea of thinking about small groups of people who might do this, who might do this work. But at different points, I am concerned that, I think it was Greg who said this, that so much, we're very concerned about what happens in pre-K. We're a little bit more concerned about kindergarten. I think there are so few incentives to really think about what's happening with kids in grades 3 and 4. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Mostly because I think we're a little bit nervous about what we will find. And the other is, I think your earlier point, Marty, about whether with fade out versus convergence. And what are the kind of multiple other issues that confront kids? In the city of Philadelphia, the mayor, the current mayor.
You need your mic.
The current mayor decided that he would take on early childhood education and early child development. And so we have a soda tax. And of course, everyone came in and they were very upset because obviously poor people need to drink more soda. But this tax went in, and he spent a lot of time looking at what he called, or what many of us call, kind of early childhood deserts, right? Mm-hmm. Where there's no early childhood program to be found. So our next step is to get the mayor, and there's been like a 30% increase in the number of kids who have now gone to early childhood, and in Santa Fe, they're considering some of the same issues. I just talked to Jeannie Oakes about this. So we now have people kind of paying attention to young children who are policymakers at the local level, and we've paid a lot of attention to what happens at the federal level, but so much can be done at local and state levels. And now to push the local policymakers to think about what's going on once those kids cross the threshold of the school in the kindergarten and spend more time thinking strategically about what happens up through grade 5.
So I am thinking about, or today makes me think about, and I've been thinking more generally about 2 areas of research that I think might be useful for us to pursue. One is to be thinking more about these intermediate outcomes, moving beyond test scores. And so what are some other behavioral supports like school attendance, like special education placements, but others that could be really important markers for how children are going to be traversing successfully or less successfully through elementary school and middle school, high school. But for us to look, so I think that for us to broaden our scope of what are the kinds of understanding of the processes and mechanisms in child developmental outcomes that are going to be important for children's development. So that's one area. And the second area is for us to really be looking more closely at family processes during early childhood, but also elementary school, middle childhood, for those family processes and family experiences that are either supporting what's happening in children's development, in the skills that they've developed in early childhood programs, and which ones are really serving as huge impediments for them. So looking much more closely at later family moderators for understanding when and how we can expect programs to be succeeding, and when we're saying what's remarkable is that children are doing as well as they're doing under the circumstances that they are facing. And so I think those would be, I think we need to take children and early childhood out of their bubble and putting it into that broader bubble, or a broader context.
There's an interesting way in which we really talk about it too, because let's be honest, some children are struggling in ways because of, Steve Rodenbush says, I know the new book is coming out, so I'll read something about what they found. But, some of these kids are struggling to get to school. And we behave sometimes as though it's just this natural path, it's a clear path. With school districts, they are navigating such treacherous terrain that school becomes a setting in which it's a refuge, as opposed to necessarily a place where they're going to be highly engaged. And I think being honest about some of those social issues that they're confronting, some of those other contextual factors, there is the reality of extreme poverty and there is the reality of racism. And so many of those things will impinge upon the ways in which these children are traveling to school that may or may not have anything to do with, what's actually happening in the classroom.
And I think the issue of difficulty getting to school starts very early. One of the things that's wonderful that I've been seeing is that the research on attendance in early childhood programs is not taking a gotcha approach, but taking an approach that attendance problems are a flag for challenges. Getting to school or in the family that a family worker should then help the family with. So we need to begin looking early. And Deborah, I so appreciate your point about expanding the range of outcomes in grades 3 and 4. And I often wonder if we should be looking at self-concept as a learner. I'm competent going to school, or parents' perceptions of the child as, you know how to do this. And I don't know if there are measures of this, but I wonder. I'm gonna now expand the discussion. I see eager participants, and I want to bring the microphone out to the floor. But before I do, I just want to honor and thank George Wimberly. George, do you mind standing for a moment? Who has been critical to this cross-association collaboration, to its conceptualization and its implementation. And I know all the fellows know you, but I want to make sure that everybody here also honors your role. So let's open up now, and I'm going to be...
I have a microphone that
just
pass around.
Yes, why don't I bring the microphone down? Here we go.
I have a question and a comment, and my comment has to do with some of the organizational conditions in schools, and Vivian, you alluded to it, about the fact that some of the teachers don't even know that there's pre-K or kindergarten in their school. and those are ones where the classrooms are actually in the building, let alone the number that are located elsewhere. Those kinds of conditions that bring the teachers together from preschool through 3rd or 4th grade is really at the level of the principal in the district to be making sure that they value that kind of work. So I just think that this conversation needs to also think about the role of the leader of the school about making sure that those things happen. I don't think that all that decision making is at the level of the teacher. It's really at the level of district policy and the leadership in the school. And I guess my question, and this might go to Greg, has to do with the studies at scale of the P3, the Chicago Parent-Child Centers. And was there fade out in those in that project? Because that would essentially be looking at children's outcomes in places where we can presume there is much greater alignment from pre-K through 3rd grade.
Right, so actually both in Abecedarian as well as in the Chicago Parent Center effort, there were additional treatment arms, right, that went beyond the age 4 school year that tried to build in coordination with what happened in kindergarten, 1st grade, 2nd grade, and 3rd grade. In the building blocks mathematics intervention, there was an attempt to do a follow-on condition. So, you know, with Abecedarian, you start out with a small number of kids and you divide them up, and it's an even smaller number of kids, right? So it's very hard to conclude much. With the Chicago data, I don't think there's a uniformly stronger impact when you pair up, at least as they did it, the pre-K with what comes afterwards. Some of the impacts were more positive, but I don't think that it was uniformly so. You know, in the building blocks, I know most about the building blocks math curriculum that had a follow-on working with kindergarten and 1st grade teachers to try to get them to understand what building blocks was trying to do with math trajectories. You know, there was a little bit of an effect, so there wasn't complete fade out, but there was maybe 75% fade out. So, you know, it wasn't a very intensive effort, but, you know, I think in terms of research questions, the issue of the interactions between having had some pre-K treatment, right, coupled with being in either a classroom that was geared toward higher level learners versus low level, you know, had an explicit curriculum arm that tried to promote these kinds of things, or as a function of what fraction of kids were actually coming from pre-K into the classroom. You know, you'd expect, if there really is that kind of synergy, that you'd expect to see interactions between treatment status in pre-K and the quality of classroom conditions in kindergarten and 1st grade. And one of my colleagues, Jay Jenkins, has been working on this, and it's very frustrating because with the Head Start Impact Study, you don't find it. With building blocks, you don't really find it. So, you know, all of this idea that it really is important to align what goes on in pre-K to what goes on in the subsequent grades, it's such a obvious idea, but it's very, very hard to find evidence supporting that. So I think that's a very, very fruitful area for research and experimentation.
Let me follow up just a little bit too. If you look at the Chicago Child Parent Centers, if you look at those outcomes when those kids are like 13, 14, actually starting 11, 12, 13, 14, the academic test score effects, you don't see them. And you don't see them on the IQ in Abecedarian when you get in that kind of middle period. It's in the Chicago Child Parent, then if you go up into the 20s is where you start seeing it on educational attainment and reductions in crime and things like that. So you get in those adult outcomes, they're not test score outcomes. And the test score stuff really does, as Greg has been saying, it declines during elementary school and middle school.
Yeah, so I don't know, if I could just expand.
Yeah.
In this, this paper on fade out, right, I think one view is what pre-K or Head Start should do to produce these long-term effects is find the right kind of capacity and build it up, right? It's the kind of a skill building idea. And if only we can find, you know, it may not be math, it may not be literacy because kids are catching up in those things. Maybe it's kind of budding academic motivation and interest. Maybe it's grit, you know, Angela Duckworth's kind of thing. If only we could find it and build it up, we would receive benefits that would pay off, you know, into the indefinite future. That's really just, this kind of skill building idea is really just one possible way in which persistent impacts might be generated. Another is what Deborah talked about with special education placement, grade failure, things like that. It's a perspective that comes out of developmental science, where the idea isn't to nurture some skill early on that will pay off into the indefinite future. It's being at the right place at the right time, you know, building up in a temporary way the right kind of capacities to get kids through periods of risk, right? So you can think of getting off track in early grades through special education, through grade failure, you know, different ways in which kids get off to a really stuttering start that they may never recover from, right? And if, you know, Abecedarian reduced rates of special education placement by 20 percentage points. It reduced rates of grade failure by 25 percentage points, right? Maybe that was the secret sauce, right? That it kept kids on track in the Durham or the Chapel Hill schools that enabled them to kind of sustain the momentum rather than any eternal skills that got built up. So it's a different perspective. And it's a totally different focus, because then you start thinking of, well, if there are these traps that schools set for kids, let's attend to those, right? And make sure that they don't act in ways, I mean, a lot of special education programs are really wonderful and provide the kind of help that kids need to stay on track, right? But, you know, some schools set up systems where that's not the case. So this kind of prevention science perspective, I think, directs us toward a whole different set of considerations for what might be going on in the early grades that might be very, very important for generating persistent impacts of pre-K and avoiding fade out.
Only thing I would say, thank you, I keep, in response to your point about the principles, I think it's a completely different way of preparing people. It's a very different way, thank you. Lack of sleep, sorry. It's a very different way of thinking about how we even go about the day-to-day expectations of principals, because there are, not only did the teachers not know where the classes were, sometimes the principals didn't know, not because they didn't care, but because the demands, and these were in schools that were in very low-income areas, where they were, you know, fighting a number of issues on a daily basis. But I actually think that's exactly where it needs to come from. So the question is, how do we build better beginnings for children by creating, casting the net a bit more broadly, to think about going to principals, giving principals data about who the kids are who are going to come here to school, who are the parents, what does this neighborhood, you know, look like, who are the people in the neighborhoods, as opposed to just showing up in a school and looking at the data, the test scores of the kids. And then to give them the time to engage the teachers in not what the punishment is going to be if your kids are not scoring at a certain level, but what is it that you need on a day-to-day basis to engage these kids and their families. One of the things we kind of didn't talk about quite as much, Deborah mentioned it, was, you know, how do we engage these families and parents? Part of what happens, particularly as kids get older and parents who are in low-income communities have opportunities to go back to work or have to work, is that kids are kind of on their own sometimes. But in addition to that, the ways in which schools reach out to parents is quite different. The way that they reach out is ostensibly different, and the relationship between teachers and parents may begin to be pulled back a little. And so there is an issue of sustainability, of participation, of engagement, of who teachers think the parents are, and opportunities to bring parents into the schools in a very different way. This is just both observation as well as what we learned, I think, from our study.
Well, I've got one. I would like every one of you to reach out to a principal that's in your area to teach them about early childhood, because so many principals don't know what to do. I wrote a chapter for principal called Learning to Love Your Noisy Neighbor, because when you bring, say, a pre-K program into an elementary school, it's very confusing to principals. They don't understand why they need to be near a bathroom, why they need water close by, why they don't walk in nice lines, and to provide some really great research-based professional development for local principals, I think, would be a great gift to the early childhood community, because you have sway that the teachers and even the community members don't have.
And what their role can be, I'll just try to talk about it, what their role can be in bridging these early childhood teachers and their colleagues. They sometimes just think it's fluff. You know, I know I've heard people say, principals say, oh, when they have a strike, well, you know, the only people who will be willing to come back are those early childhood teachers because they like the little children. Well, it's more than that. There's a reason that, you know, that they're there. And I would just like to see that be a part of principals. The certificate programs, but also a part of how we teach them. I think there's a role for schools of education here and people who are doing teacher preparation. If people who are planning to teach elementary school kids, but not necessarily pre-K kids, actually had to understand something about young children, that would be a plus. And I think if courses that allowed folks who are going to teach early childhood to understand what the, what they might expect along a child's trajectory, that would actually begin to move the field a bit further.
Another comment or question?
Hi. So I'm a research fellow on the Chicago Longitudinal Study. And I'm like, do I say anything? Do I not? Everything you said was great, because that could have gotten really uncomfortable. But what I did want to add was that when we looked at just the follow-on program, so that was kids who participated in 1st through 3rd grade, there was no real impact of just those years. So that preschool participation seems to be, you know, really important to their dosage, basically. And then we do see fade out, but it seems to fade out slower, and we think that that's because we have this follow-on program. What Reynolds and O are writing right now, and I actually think it's in press, is looking at the pre-K to 1st grade, pre-K to 2nd grade, what is the added value of each additional year of participation in this pre-K to 3rd grade model? And the key being is, that quality was maintained through the years, and that's what we did a recent scale up of the program where we actually went into 1st grade classrooms, 2nd grade classrooms, and watched for quality in each additional year. So we kind of are more aware of what was going on in the 1st through 3rd grade classrooms. And then another thing, looking at those longer term outcomes, though the achievement outcomes do fade out, we do still see a bump in high school graduation. So what we're trying to understand now is there a different mechanism through which kids who attend the program, something is changed that causes them to then graduate high school, even though we maybe don't see the pathway through attendance. So that's what we're currently working on. We have a measure that was collected in 8th grade that gets at practical skills and life skills, and so we're working on that right now. So, yeah.
Great. Do you mind just giving your name?
Oh, sure. I'm Nicole Smarillo from the Chicago Longitudinal Study, or Human Capital Research Collaborative at the University of Minnesota.
Thank you. I just think as we try to build a community, people should know each other. And Terry, please could you just say why you're interested in leadership?
I'm Terry Talon, and I'm from McCormick Center for Early Childhood Leadership, which is a part of National Louis University.
Thank you. So people should approach each other and ask more about their work.
Thank you all. My name is Zeynep Ercan. I'm from Rowan University. I'm really focusing on this idea of intellectual loss, where we hit with the No Child Left Behind, because like you're saying, this discontinuity between the high focus on intellectual, social, emotional, and overall developmental, gains through early childhood years, and the lack of focus on measuring that in elementary school, thus not making it a focus for teachers. We see it as a teacher educator myself. In the teacher ed programs, we have seen this forever, but our push is not enough. As at Rowan, for instance, we have just one course solely focusing on intellectual development, differentiated instruction, really taking the kids to the next level, and each of them and every one of them. However, when it comes to the district, the goals are set to a minimum and focusing on this, like really lowest performing children, and thus, we could see why this is happening from the spectrum from K to 12 or even 16. So what are your thoughts of, would you imagine if you ever had on the dream world and you could decide on this perfect intervention, curricular intervention that is happening in a school setting? Think about public school, maybe, whatever grade level you imagine. What would that look like so that would take the focus of narrow academics to a broad range of developmental capabilities, including academics? What would you have liked to see done so that we could follow on your footsteps with our own areas?
Great question. I bring the microphone back. Does anybody want to respond to that?
Well, I would focus on kindergarten, because I think human beings are at their highest level of development in kindergarten, and then we just go downhill. And I have a hunch that there's not one intervention that's going to work for everyone. There's this, to be responsive is what you need for instruction, for a kid to be able to make progress, and not all children are the same. So finding different models of instruction that look at the child as a broad type of human being that has academic needs, but has social needs, has physical needs, emotional needs, and that you have to have instruction that has high expectations for the academic work while working with children in a variety of contexts, including play. In kindergarten, so crazy. But it's not play as marshmallow fluff. It's intellectually engaged play where the teacher is there scaffolding learning, not pulling kids out for assessments or changing bulletin boards. It really is that's the richest time, I think. And so that's going to require not only curriculum development, it's going to require professional development, because I think we've currently are building a generation of kindergarten teachers that don't know how to do that kind of instruction. And we need to have good PR and education for the rest of the system to understand how that can be a fruitful approach.
Karen Bierman has done very good work adding a socio-emotional curriculum to Head Start centers. And Joe Durlock has a review of socio-emotional programs of various sorts. It's a meta-analysis in the early grades. So I think we know from good studies about how to develop socio-emotional skills. One of the case studies that Dick Bernane and I studied in the Restoring Opportunity book was the Boston pre-K system, where their curriculum was an integrated one, and the evaluation actually showed gains in executive function skills, right, at the end of the pre-K year. So I think we have the tools to put together curricula that promote both academic as well as socio-emotional skills. And let's get to it. And then you asked for the kind of dream scenario, right? Let's get to it in an integrative way that pulls together all of the things we've been talking about, right? Where the principal is the instructional leader and realizes that an effective pre-K year is going to make the job of the kindergarten teachers and first grade teachers that much easier and more enjoyable, right? So this kind of integration, co-location, let's not have silos where a second grade teacher never teaches in pre-K or a pre-K teacher never teaches in first grade. The more integrated we are across pre-K and these early grades, I think the more effective we're going to be.
I think that part of it too is that schools are driven, motivated by assessment. And so to the extent that you are being funded or measured in terms of one set of outcomes, that's going to be what literacy and math are big drivers. And for us to be thinking about and having assessments that can have us also be thinking about areas related to social interactions, grit kinds of concepts, motivation concepts, and for those to be part of the routine toolbox, and for researchers to be really developing reliable, valid performance assessments as well as paper pencil reports. Well, I think will help guide. If you can measure it, people will say, oh, this must be important. Mm-hmm. And if you don't measure it, they kind of put it to the side.
One of the things that we did, just tell me I'm supposed to be keeping a secret and then I'm loud. One of the things that I wanted to just suggest, that I know we're talking back to you, but it might be kind of interesting if actually people have, as you did, comments or answers for some of these questions, because there are lots of talented people in the audience as well. But the only thing I wanted to say in reference to Deborah and Beth as well is that, oh God, I really don't want this, do I? Oh my God. I know. Fortunately, they're going to have it pinned on me tomorrow when I give that talk. But it's I remember this from the clips that you showed from your work and folks in Boston. And I remember thinking that, reflecting on the fact that our early childhood teachers found that way of interacting with each other so different than what they had been doing before. You know, it's commonplace in the upper grades and in high school, things like learning communities and practitioner inquiry, you know. But these were kind of new ideas, and part of that relearning was learning, well, not relearning, but learning for the first time how you kind of take down, you know, the silos, how you actually collaborate with other teachers in a way that doesn't serve to punish you, but to enhance what you do. And so that's an area of work that I would like people to kind of think about across fields, particularly as we try to get principals on board, but also kind of make the teachers themselves develop a sense of confidence about their own power and knowledge.
I do want to say that there's an important caution in the consensus report about curricula, which is your chapter, Greg, which is it's very easy to get glib and talk about whole child curricula that don't have enough content. And it's really important to read this chapter. How many more minutes do we have? About 5?
I have 5 till, so.
5, but we are between the audience and lunch.
Okay.
I hang out with Terry in Chicago. I'm Marie Masterson, and I oversee assessment in Illinois. And my question is, since we know the opportunity, equity, and access gap begins before pre-K, how can we broaden the pre-K research so that we look back and get those levers in where they need to be in terms of high quality, particularly for toddlers, and address that cognitive gap in the 2-year-old year. And then also, because I am from Chicago, and I attended a session on trauma-informed teaching. And that conversation was built as kindergarten through 12th grade, as though children did not exist until they came to public school. And I chose not to speak in that session, but we are dealing with children whose executive function and well-being are in need of leverage, and they need that leverage in the 2-year-old, 3-year-old, and 4-year-old years. So if you could address that, I would appreciate it.
It's a tall order.
I just wanted to add that to the conversation because it hadn't been here.
No, and I couldn't agree more. Part of it raises a whole set of parent support issues, and as Marty mentioned, there actually will be a session this afternoon on the Parenting Matters report coming out of the National Academy of Sciences.
All the questions.
Hey.
So there are some successful models, right? Ken Dodge has Durham Connects, which is really a screening home visit program that tries to identify very high-risk families shortly after the child is born and connect them with community services, right? And there are other, the Triple P does that as well, right? So in terms of the subset of kids, and it fortunately is not a huge subset of kids that need a lot of intensive intervention, right? You want to identify them quickly and get really, really good programs directed at them. I'd put on the table income support programs. Since welfare reform in 1996, there's really been a dual track in terms of how low-income families are faring. We have supported work much more than we had before with the earned income tax credit and child care subsidies and things like that. So families that have been able to maintain a really continuous connection to the labor market are better off now than they were prior to welfare reform, but at the same time there's another substantial group of parents who haven't been able to maintain. And with programs like TANF essentially disappearing in a lot of states, I think we need to rethink what sort of basic support programs that we have. A child allowance, for example, paid monthly. Canada, I learned, just put in place in May, I think, a $6,000 per child per year child allowance. Everybody gets that, right? It's a monthly payment to try to stabilize economic conditions. So it's not just the kind of programs that might be directed at the kids or parenting programs directed at the... So, it's a whole set of social programs that we should be putting on the table.
Including high quality early care. It can't really start at 4 or 3. Or 2.
I want to ask
It's on. Turn it on.
And the other co-author on the consensus report, any comments? Anything you want to add from it? Okay, just be sure to look at the other chapters too, because there's very rich materials in there. Okay, we have time for one last question? Okay.
Kim Robinson from the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. I'm wondering, it's really interesting to hear this conversation and all of the nuance and all of the opportunities to understand things better. And yet in the sort of policy space, particularly at the federal but also at state levels, you're hearing people say, well, I just don't think there's really any evidence to support early child care and education, and and some of that is sort of the dismissiveness of the older, smaller studies. The fact that Tennessee had poor results, and that's Senator Alexander's state, certainly isn't helping anything. And so I'm wondering if, given those sorts of challenges, if you could speak a little bit on some of the things that you think are still compelling and could potentially be, those arguments to be made with folks who are not necessarily being compelled by things they've seen so far.
The report, I mean, that consensus report doesn't mince words, doesn't try to hide anything. It's a reasoned, rational, compelling argument about what we know and where we need to go more, to learn more.
But, I mean, it's most compelling, the evidence for the end of pre-K, right? After that, it seems to me that we need to just play it straight with the evidence. It is quite possible, I think, to set up a pre-K system that doesn't work, that's a waste of money. And we have to recognize that. I think we have to realize that a lot of the money that we spend on Head Start probably isn't spent very wisely, right? It's only when we admit that to ourselves and put improvement on the agenda and what does it take in terms of connections between pre-K and what comes after pre-K? Those are all things that we need to solve. And until we can solve them, we can't just go back and say, well, look what Perry did, look what Abecedarian did. We want to, it's tricky because you don't want to be so negative that the funding is removed, never to come back, right? But I think the way to cast it is that there's tremendous potential here. We have proof of concept through some of the older programs. Evidence now is mixed, and we're just now making progress in models that are going to be likely to be generating more consistent longer-term impacts and and a higher return on investment, which people like to hear.
And this report is focusing on the academic outcomes. Many of the longer-term ones, as you've been saying, are in other areas. We're not there yet. This evidence base is beginning. So I think the report is very humble and honest about that, and I appreciated that.
I saw your hand up earlier. Sitting next to Aaron, yes. I think you're one of our colleagues from South America? Yeah. Yeah, terrific.
Yeah, I'm Ruben Klein from Brazil, Fundação César Rio Foundation. Well, this is, I think, is a very important issue. Like inequality start at birth, right? So it's very hard to decrease, to diminish, to bring equality. So child care is I think is very important, and you need good quality child care, and you have to follow. I follow some of the studies, all the studies say that, you have some good experimental studies, high quality child care, and then the kids go to school, and then you see the decrease. So social emotional attitude behavior seems to stand. Okay, so one thing I don't know how this is controlled, because one thing we know is that if you're in a good school, if you're a good level, you go then you move to a bad school, to a bad level, you're going to suffer. You're going to stop going up. So I don't know how much. Like these kids, I don't know where these kids they were in these good programs, and they went to schools. Apparently, they went to common schools, regular schools, and apparently they were put together with other kids, and they probably were minority. So I think the tendency is to the peers to put down. So some of the figures socio-emotional states, but as time goes by, maybe things go down. I would like to know if there's an experiment where, we put these kids when they were to good schools, where they were well motivated to go on. That would make a big difference. So I know that in education, The context is very important. There are a lot of things to look at, and anything can change completely the results. So I think we really have to look more. I know about Brazil. In Brazil, if you look at the general data, apparently preschool makes a 4 and 5-year-old makes a difference. People who go or don't go. But the quality is very, very different all over. Some places where we can have where they have more preschool, we don't have the best results. But probably it will be much worse if we didn't have the preschool. So the quality is very clear. This quality is important. When you look at the data before preschool for 4-year-old, you don't see much of a difference. The evidence, the only thing exploratory data I've done, is that for upper class, you see the difference. But of course, the upper class, they have this good quality preschool, child care for all over the place, and they go to good schools. So it makes a difference, can make a difference. Okay, so I think there are a lot of things to be done. I think I'd like to see the reports, to have a copy to know, because it's very interesting. Like now in Brazil, we're implementing a national basic curriculum for the first time. I think that's very important. Unfortunately, I think we're going to have something also for early childhood, preschool, and even before some guidelines, some kind of curriculum. And I think it will be very important to have some good assessment of basic skill of kids. Of course, it's not testing or everything, but we have to know. We have to have guidelines. We have to know what every kid in the country should, the skills they should develop, and we should be able to assess that, if this is being done or not. I think this is very important. So there are a lot of things to be done.
Thank you.
Okay, I think it was a nice panel. Thanks.
Thank you. I think looking at those issues across space, and this is one of the people who is a part of the Americas Initiative, which is something else. We created an Americas Initiative this year in AERA, bringing together North America, South America, and the Caribbean. And it's one of our participants, and I think what you speak to, the kind of cross-cutting, the issues that are cross-national, the issue of context, the school does matter. The school where the child goes is an important thing to consider. But I think both in July and as you spoke, I was just thinking about the ways in which our issues go across the borders. And certainly, I don't know, are you presenting? Are you doing a presentation here? Oh, not on this? Okay, but we'll have other times to talk about that. Okay, well, thanks so much.
I think it's time for us to wrap up, and I actually, I have a very strong feeling that this is the beginning of a discussion and not the end of a discussion. I want to thank the panelists for helping us spark this discussion. I want to thank AERA and SRCD for encouraging us all to think through both lenses. I want to congratulate the fellows and thank George also. Please join me in